I'm Carola Schönlieb, I'm Professor of Applied Mathematics. Welcome to my exp. A lot of times if I look at a piece of art, a particular historical piece of art, this art piece has gone through a process. It has maybe survived centuries, several, political things happening, several weather-related things happening. So it has gone through a lot of things. And you can see this in the painting, right? It maybe also some manipulation that has happened to this art piece where people have maybe overpainted something or removed things and things like this. So where we come in as mathematical imaging people is that we are trying to go back and discover what has been lost, or maybe not completely lost, but what is not visible to the human eye anymore. And this is also, on a mathematical terms, you can phrase this as an inverse problem. Inverse problems is about you take a measurement, which is basically, let's say, a digital photograph in our case, of an image now, or it could be in scientific imaging, we don't just take a photograph, but we take maybe a more sophisticated photograph like spectral imaging, multispectral imaging that can take images beyond the visible light spectrum, like infrared imaging, for instance. Or I can also do X-ray imaging to a painting. And so I look at this and I want to understand, based on this data, I want to understand what the image that I don't know anymore, that has, that is not available to me, but what the image at the origin or throughout time has looked like before. And this is an inverse problem. It's about having measurements, but not being directly interested in exactly what is in these measurements, but being interested in something that is hidden in these measurements indirectly. And it's about inverting, this is why inverse problem, the process, the forward process, which is history basically, that has happened to this art piece. This is an illuminated manuscript from the 16th century. Is a children's book, is a primer that has been commissioned by the Queen of Brittany for her daughter Claude, that on the one hand teaches the alphabet, but also at the same time tells the story of biblical creation. And so what you can see in these illuminations that come alongside basically the written words is Adam and Eve in paradise, and how they live in paradise, and how Eve eats the apple and they are expelled, and so on and so forth. Now, when this was commissioned and when it was made, Adam and Eve were painted as naked. From the biblical story, they're still in paradise, they're without sin and everything, so it makes sense that they're naked. But later on, this book got into the possession of a different owner who was not so happy with a children's book with naked people, basically. And so they had another artist commissioned to overpaint Adam and Eve with skirts. What we did is whether we can digitally show how these illuminations have looked like before this overpainting has happened. So illuminations are very specific here because illuminations usually would never physically restore because they're very fragile and they are in danger to break if you do too much to them. In addition to to just photographs of these illuminations, what the Fitzwilliam Museum also did is they did some spectral imaging, in particular infrared imaging. And so you can also see this on screen. The infrared image actually allowed us to look through the skirts and detect the structure underneath. So what we did is we now combined the photograph with the colors and everything, and the textures with the structures, the outline of Eve and Adam's body underneath, and inpainted the colors into the domain of the skirt, following the structures that are given from the infrared image, if this makes sense. The inpainting result, the digital restoration result, will depend on the partial differential equation I use. If I use another equation, it will look slightly different. If I use something else than a partial differential equation, like a neural network, it will look again different. So depending on the type of image processing methodology I use, I get different results. Again, all of them may be to some extent plausible. But they depend a lot on what assumptions you're putting into the restoration process. So, thinking about this, the question arises, is mathematics to some extent applied to art also an art in itself? An art about finding the right methodology to do the restoration? To some extent, I would say yes. So mathematics as language, as natural language, is just a formalized language with grammar attached to it that tells you what you can do in mathematics and what not, that you can put together, under the constraints of the formalism. You have the freedom of putting it together in whatever way you want. And so to some extent, yes, I think mathematics applied actually anywhere, not just in art, is an art in itself, in finding the right models. The main driver for developing methodologies, differential equations, to do the image inpainting is to create something visually plausible. The inpainting results depends on the modeling assumptions that you put into the differential equation or whatever mathematical model you use that should solve the inpainting process. Now, a funny example that I always like to show here, that these modeling assumptions or any kind of prior conceptions that you might have, of course, influence how you restore images, is this example of a Spanish woman close to Zaragoza, who was a frequent visitor to a church where there was a Jesus Christ portrait there. And this portrait was heavily damaged, was in this church, for more than 100 years, but it was damaged. And so this woman felt so awful about this that she, took up the task of actually restoring this portrait herself. And she did. And so this got through the news. You can see her restored version on screen. This went through the news a lot a couple of years ago. The title of the original portrait is Ecce Homo. The title of the new portrait that she created is Ecce Mono. So this is a bit of a mockery of what she did. Looks like a monkey or something like this. Not like Jesus Christ anymore. But of course, it's a bit subjective here, what you think is good or not. Maybe what you see in Ecce Mono is less subjective, because most of us will agree that it is not so close anymore to Jesus Christ portrait that we started with. But this is the thing about image restoration and inpainting, or inverse problems in imaging in general, that everything depends on the prior information you put in and how close you stick to the data, to the evidence, in this case to the damaged Jesus Christ painting or fresco that you have.